Good morning, good afternoon and good evening to everyone who is joining us. We're just letting people in as they arrive, so that'll just continue to happen as we get going. I begin our webinar today by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land from where I sit today, where people have been meeting and talking for thousands of years. I pay my respects to those elders who are past, present and emerging for their custodianship of country, and extend my respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here today. I also welcome the many custodians of lands and seas around the world. We know we have lots of friends joining from around the Pacific today. Collectively, your gracious wisdom and leadership is present, it is welcome, and it is core to the mission for a successful, sustainable ocean economy and ocean future. If I could please request that all participants mute their speakers, but do feel free to leave your video on so we can feel connected to faces as we begin today. My name is Jazz Chambers, and together with my colleagues from Ocean Decade Australia, Dr. Lucy Buxton and Rachel Scott, we thank our exceptional team of presenters for their time and energy today in bringing their expertise to this very big topic of ocean governance and exploring some of the contemporary issues that are being contemplated globally and, of course, in Australia. Before we dive into that part of our session, I would like to invite Dr. Buxton to provide a short debrief regarding the UN Ocean Decade Conference in Barcelona that we just returned from, the activities that we undertook as Ocean Decade Australia and observations, and also the key outcomes of the conference. Thanks, Lucy.
Thanks, Jazz. It's great to join everyone here today. So yes, as Jazz has mentioned, we recently returned from Barcelona, where we were lucky enough to join the Ocean Decade Conference, which was the uniting of, sorry, let me just pull up, taking stock and celebrating the achievements of 3 years after the start of the decade. And participants represented governments, universities, the private sector, non-governmental organizations, and other stakeholders to gather for a 3-day event to reflect on progress and set a collective vision and joint priorities for the rest of the decade. There were 1,500 participants in person, representing over 124 countries, and we were joined online by 3,000 viewers and 120 satellite events that were held over the week. Some photos to give you a feel for the variety of activities that were undertaken. So at the conference and in the lead up to it, Ocean Decade Australia helped support the coordination and connection between Australia's delegates. That included a pre-conference briefing. And while we were on the ground, we also, as Ocean Decade Australia, had the opportunity to join the Global National Decade Committee Working Group, which was a fantastic opportunity to meet a variety of coordinating groups from across the world. We hosted a reception that was a fantastic opportunity to meet some of the international delegates, and also presented in a session around the outcomes from our most recent white paper. We attended over 20 meetings, specifically with key global partners, experts and leaders, and we also collected survey feedback from the Australian delegates, which will be synthesized and disseminated in a communication to our ODA stakeholders. Some of the key themes that we picked up on during the conference was the very strong focus on sea country heritage and cultural knowledge, and the need to bring that very strongly into the decade and into the science being planned. The importance of broad stakeholder engagement from science to non-science communities, and the need for national coordination, noting that Australia currently does not have a national decade committee. Measurement and informed decision-makings were key parts of the discussion from the week, and there was also strong Pacific leadership and a conversation around the opportunity for Australia to, who is participating, but also opportunities to extend that in regional partnerships. The main conference outcome was the Barcelona statement, which identifies 3 sets of key priorities noted here. Given that we are the global south, and there is a lot of global north in these conversations at many of these meetings, it was great to hear from our perspective the discussion on the leadership already being shown by big ocean sovereign states and least developed countries, and the critical need to distill their perspectives and to actively create opportunities for south-to-south exchange and collaboration. Through the discussions held at the conference, participants provided input into a set of 10 white papers, which correspond to the United Nations Decade's 10 Challenges. These inputs will be incorporated into the final versions of the white papers and an outcomes document that will be released in May. The white papers identify the future priorities of the ocean decade to generate knowledge and science-based solutions. Sorry, just bear with me. Thanks, Rach. On my last slide, I'd just like to finish with this, that the conference noted that the UN Ocean Decade, since its debut in 2021, has become the largest global ocean science initiative ever undertaken. And the conference participants recognized that it was taking place at a unique moment in the global ocean governance landscape, with the recent emergence of several international agreements and treaties, of which we will hear more about from today's presenters. It was recognized the potential of the Ocean Decade to contribute essential science and knowledge to support implementation of these instruments. But I leave you with this quote from Vidar Helgesen, which eloquently points to the fact that science cannot act alone, and we must develop more effective processes for aligning and actioning policy. And on that note, I will hand back to Jazz. Thanks, Jazz.
Thank you, Lucy. And we will continue to admit people to the call as they come in. On Executive Secretary Helgesen's note here, he also noted that there remained challenges which the Vision 2030 process was designed to address by assessing the state of play for each of the 10-decade challenges. Next slide, please. And just a reminder, this is the framework, providing recommendations to sharpen the process and fill the gaps that remained. The gaps that were identified included critical knowledge gaps in the deep sea, pollution, small-scale fisheries, and the ocean economy. So there is still plenty of work to do, as we know, in building our knowledge base about ocean. But as part of pursuing knowledge, understanding how we govern the ocean, the rules that humans have designed, is critical. And I'm delighted to first up introduce Professor Donald Rothwell as our first speaker. Don is a professor of international law at the ANU College of Law, at the where he has taught since July 2006. His research has a specific focus on law of the sea, polar law, and implementation of international law within Australia. I've been enjoying the 3rd edition of Don's leading work with Tim Stevens, The International Law of the Sea, which is an incredible resource on this topic, and it's a real privilege to have Don with us today. I'll hand over to you, Don. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jazz, for that introduction. And I'm coming to you today from Ngunnawal country in Canberra in the ACT, and I pay my respects to the Ngunnawal people and their leaders, past, present, and emerging. If we can just go to my first slide. In my presentation today, I've been asked to provide an overall framework of the legal mechanisms that deal with the oceans, and that predominantly relates to the provisions of the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. But I will increasingly begin to narrow down and focus on some of the critical issues that are now rising in 2024 with respect to that UN Convention and its associated instruments. So if we go to the next slide, the evolution of the law of the sea is one that we saw some significant developments arise post-World War II with the emergence of the United Nations, which provided a forum in which the international community could move forward to, at least at a treaty level, develop a number of instruments that deal with the oceans. And so in 1958, we had the Geneva Conventions concluded, the so-called Geneva Conventions concluded. There are actually 4 conventions concluded in 1958, and they provided a base level framework for regulating certain maritime zones, the high seas, and some aspects of fishing in the high seas. But it needs to be observed that they were fairly rudimentary, and it was never really expected that they would be the final word. So we then emerged into the 1970s, and we had this very long-running third United Nations Conference on the Law of the Sea, which predominantly met in New York and was spread across 11 sessions between 1973 and 82. And eventually we saw the conclusion of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which I mostly refer to as the LOSC in my writing. Now, the LOSC is universally referred to as the Constitution of the Oceans. It is, if you like, the real starting point for understanding from a legal perspective and a multilateral legal perspective how we should view the oceans. Most importantly, the convention is known as a compact deal, in the sense that there were an awful lot of negotiations that obviously took place across that period. There were many concessions that took place during that period. There was very much a debate and discussion between developed states and the G77 states as they existed at that time. And consequently, the convention is a very carefully negotiated so-called package deal, and one in which very little variation is allowed outside of that. Now, that might go to reflect the fact that the United States has never become a party to the convention, partly because of US objections to the deep seabed mining provisions found in Part 11 of the convention. But the United States has this somewhat ambiguous position in that it says that it respects much of the convention. It says that it takes the view that much of the convention reflects customary international law, but it has yet to formally become a party to the convention. And that creates some issues in terms of the interactions of the United States with a number of other countries around the world. The convention, though, as I said, albeit called the Constitution of the Oceans, was never really understood as being totally complete. And so there was an ongoing project in terms of developing the convention to fill in some of the gaps, one of which was the conclusion of the Fish Stocks Agreement, and arguably the Agreement on Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction is another example. If we go to the next slide, you can see that some of the critical achievements reached in the convention was certainty with respect to the range of maritime zones, many of which I'm going to assume that you're familiar with in terms of at least hearing about them. But the convention provided a real level of certainty as to what the outer limits of those maritime zones were, and also what the entitlements were of coastal states and also the other members of the international community within those various zones. And as a counterpoint to that, it was really critical that there be a lot of certainty about navigational rights and freedoms, not only over the high seas, but also over critical waters such as international straits, archipelagic waters, and also the territorial sea close to the coastline. So we get real certainty and clarity in the convention in terms of what exactly those navigational rights and freedoms are. But of course, you'll be well aware that some of those issues are closely contested. And indeed, we had a situation arise last week in terms of the Chinese People's Liberation Army contesting the way in which HMAS Hobart was conducting certain navigational rights in the Yellow Sea. We also saw in the convention Part 12 dealing with protection of the marine environment, which was a very innovative provision and which provides an important framework for marine environmental protection, and I'll come to that in a moment. but also most importantly, because this was a major driver in the negotiations, the resolution of a legal regime for the deep seabed, the area beyond national jurisdiction, but more particularly the area beyond the limit of the continental shelf, under which the common heritage regime was to be applicable. This was a position strongly advanced by the group of 77 states during the negotiation of the convention. And so that was a major innovative development in the convention, and created for the first time a legal framework for the regulation and management, exploration, and ultimately the exploitation of the resources in the deep seabed. So if we come to the next slide, we therefore end up with a very complex set of zonal entitlements that exist under the law of the sea. And this slide here, a slide produced by Geoscience Australia, seeks to depict the way in which those maritime zonal entitlements are asserted offshore a coastline. And so we move from the 12 nautical mile territorial sea, we have the adjacent 24 nautical mile contiguous zone, and then beyond that we have the much more broader resource zones of the exclusive economic zone and also the continental shelf. And to that end, we need to acknowledge the interaction between the EEZ regime and also the continental shelf regime. This slide is helpful because it demonstrates that whilst every country has a minimal entitlement to a 200 nautical mile continental shelf, in many instances, including in the case of Australia, countries can seek to assert an extended continental shelf consistent with Article 76 of the Convention, which can go beyond that 200 nautical mile limit. And so that is reflected in the sort of blue bubble that you can see on the extremity of the slide here. And so a number of countries, as I said, including Australia, have a continental shelf partly around, in Australia's case, the Australian mainland, and also offshore Tasmania and some of the offshore islands, that extends beyond that 200 nautical mile limit, which raises a debate from an oceans governance perspective as to where exactly the continental shelf ends and where the area beyond national jurisdiction begins. So if we go to my final slide, I just want to conclude by highlighting some of the major developments that have arisen. I said that the Law of the Sea Convention and the multilateral governance framework established by the convention is a work in progress. And so to that end, the conclusion last year of the Seas Biodiversity Treaty was a really significant development in that regard. It does, however, raise an issue that I've just alluded to, and that is the Biodiversity Treaty in the high seas seeks to apply to areas beyond national jurisdiction, and this instrument is often referred to as the BBNJ agreement, which therefore raises exactly, well, what exactly is the area beyond national jurisdiction? Given some of the uncertainties in terms of what exactly is the outer limit of the continental shelf. We then move to the common heritage regime, and we're at a really exciting point there because the International Seabed Authority, which is the governance institution which oversees Part 11 of the convention and the operationalization of deep seabed mining, is literally on the brink at the moment, possibly this year, of giving the go-ahead for the first deep seabed mining operation. So the principle of common heritage is on the brink of being operationalized, but there is significant debate within the international community as to whether this is an environmentally sustainable activity at this point in time. And indeed, there are some who suggest that there should be a moratorium placed on deep seabed mining. And then finally, we've got a major initiative that is before the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, which is expected to hand down an advisory opinion next week, brought by the Commission of Small Island States on Climate Change and International Law, in which the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea has been asked to directly address the environmental obligations on states with respect to addressing issues of climate change and the impact on small island states, and also the consequences of sea level rise arising from climate change in the oceans. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to questions during the discussion that follows.
Thank you, Don, that was fantastic overview. It's now a pleasure to introduce Nicola Clark, who leads the Pew Charitable Trust's work related to the UN Treaty on Marine Biological Diversity of Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction, or BBNJ, as we've been referring to it, as part of Pew's campaign to address gaps in ocean governance through meaningful international cooperation. Nicola serves as a strategic and technical expert on the BBNJ Treaty and specialises in high seas marine protected areas and the treaty's interaction with other management bodies. Welcome, Nicola. Over to you.
Thanks very much for that really kind introduction, Jazz. And it's really such a treat and a pleasure to be with you all today to talk about my favorite topic, the new United Nations BBNJ agreement. And so really, I thought probably the best place to start is by defining what BBNJ stands for. And that's Marine Biological Diversity Beyond National Jurisdiction. It's a bit of a mouthful, so we often say BBNJ for short, or sometimes more colloquially, just simply the High Seas Treaty. So the BBNJ Treaty's core objective is the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity beyond national jurisdiction. But it's also charged with considering a package of issues, namely marine genetic resources, area-based management tools, including marine protected areas, environmental impact assessments, and capacity building and the transfer of marine technology. So what do we actually get in the final treaty text? It's not a crazy long treaty text, but it's a decently long one. So I won't go over everything that was included, but just provide a couple of highlights to give you a little bit of a sense of some of the key provisions that were included across those different chapters. So with regard to marine genetic resources, the treaty includes requirements to share monetary benefits from marine genetic resources that are accessed in areas beyond national jurisdiction. With regard to the Marine Protected Areas chapter, the agreement sets out a legal framework as well as a process for establishing a network of high seas marine protected areas. It also establishes a process or a power, rather, of the future BBNJ decision-making body to adopt measures to respond to natural or human-caused emergencies, also known as emergency measures. With regard to environmental impact assessments, it sets out consistent standards and processes for new and unregulated high seas activities, as well as includes a number of really important transparency provisions and scientific review. And then with regard to capacity building and the transfer of marine technology, it elaborates additional guidelines and much more specific guidelines that will help facilitate the sharing of capacity and technology with a primary goal of ensuring the effective implementation of the agreement itself. So I want to talk about why this treaty is such a big deal. And I could talk about this for a long time, but I'll try and provide just a couple of the highlights. So first, there are several governance gaps on the high seas. The moment we have a fragmented puzzle of different organizations that manage different aspects of human activities in different areas on the high seas with varying degrees of effectiveness. And they usually don't do a great job of coordinating with one another. And it's in this messy patchwork approach to high seas governance that key things have slipped through the cracks. And just as one example, until this agreement, right, there's no legal mechanism to establish a comprehensive system of marine protected areas for most places on the high seas. There's also relatively weak requirements related to the conduct of environmental impact assessments for activities that are taking place there. The second reason why this is such a big deal is actually the scale, the vastness of the high seas. So the high seas make up 2/3 of the ocean, and they cover almost half of the planet's surface. And so on this map here, it's all of those areas that are in dark blue that are the high seas. And of course, high seas ecosystems are inextricably linked to those in coastal waters. These maritime zones that were established by the Law of the Sea Convention are, of course, a really brilliant human innovation, but the biodiversity doesn't care very much about them. So really, the stakes are very high for the High Seas Treaty. It will impact most of the ocean, its life, and by extension, the services a healthy ocean provides. The High Seas are also a really critical piece to meet the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework's target to protect at least 30% of the global ocean by 2030, which is also known as the 30 by 30 target. And this is not only because of the size of the high seas and just running the numbers on that one, but also because of their interlinkages and connectivity to the rest of the ocean. Currently, only about 1% of the high seas are protected, and almost all of that 1% comes from the Antarctic, which is a special case legally and biologically speaking. And then finally, the High Seas Treaty presents a really exciting opportunity to create a more equitable governance regime in a space where access to the high seas is currently limited to only a handful of generally wealthier nations. This agreement, through its benefit sharing, capacity building, and technology transfer requirements, presents an opportunity to create a more equitable ocean governance space. So what's next? So just a quick highlight of where we've been and what's coming up next. So after almost about 20 years of different levels of formal and informal talks at the United Nations, the new BBNJ agreement, or High Seas Biodiversity Treaty, was formally adopted by the United Nations in June of 2023. It formally opened for signature and ratification in September of 2023. And at the moment, there are 5 countries that have officially ratified, and once 60 countries ratify, then the treaty will enter into force, well, 120 days after 60 countries ratify. And then within 1 year of that entry into force will be the first meeting of the Conference of Parties of BBNJ, which will be the decision-making body. So just to note that there is a goal rather, that the High Seas Alliance, which is a coalition of a variety of different environmental NGOs, and as well as a number of other countries, have a goal of trying to reach that 60th ratification by the UN Ocean Conference taking place in 2025. And then I'll also say that while the treaty will enter into force 1 year after that entry, there will be a first meeting of first COP, a Conference of the Parties, that will meet within 1 year of entry into force. It has a lot of work to do, a lot of terms of reference and guidelines that will need to be adopted before the agreement can be functional. So just a couple of reflections about, in my final slide, about thinking about what's next for implementation. So we're in this really exciting phase of the BBNJ Treaty where it's been adopted, but it hasn't yet entered into force. And in this space, there's actually a lot of work that can be done to support swift and effective implementation. First, I think there's a lot of really great provisions that facilitate transparent decision-making processes and require information sharing. And I think that if there are countries who are considering ratification, this is something that would be worth starting to look at, ensuring that there are domestic procedures in place to meet those requirements. Secondly, I think there's a number of instances that call for robust stakeholder engagement. And in addition to checking that there are sufficient domestic procedures in place for that aspect, I actually think that now could be a time to start engaging with key stakeholders. For example, if there are high seas areas where there's an interest in creating a high seas marine park, it would be really great to begin those conversations now with interested stakeholders to begin to understand what specifically those conservation goals would be. Third, the High Seas Treaty, the high seas are generally a very data poor place. And so I think, again, now is an excellent time, especially considering the decade of ocean science that we are in, to start filling some of those high seas science and data gaps to provide important baseline information for impact assessments and also to help build the scientific case to support high seas marine parks. Finally, there's a lot of really important questions that still need to be answered. Figuring out what the science advisory body will look like, who serves on it, figuring out how we share those monetary benefits from marine genetic resources, how we monitor, finance, and enforce marine protected areas. So these first few meetings of the Conference of the Parties, as well as the preparatory commission that will be meeting in advance, will be working to develop answers to those really important questions. So participants at that PrepCom and at those first few Conference of Parties meetings will have this incredibly exciting opportunity to shape how BBNJ is implemented and set up for success. And with that, I will thank you very much for your attention and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Nicola, for that fantastic overview of the High Seas Biodiversity Treaty. The chat is open. If you would like to start putting questions into the chat, you are very welcome. I would like to finally welcome Dr. Tony Warby, who is recently returned from Ottawa, and the 4th session of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, or the INC, to develop an internationally legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, including in the marine environment. Tony was appointed as the inaugural Chief Scientist at Minderoo Foundation in November 2023. Prior to that, he held the role of Executive Director Oceans at Minderoo, with responsibility for the Foundation's portfolio of environmental work across oceans, plastics and climate. Welcome, Tony.
Thanks, Jazz, and thanks to all of the team at Ocean Decade Australia. This is a great event. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining the call from Whadjuk Noongar Boodja here in Western Australia, and also just acknowledge I can see lots of familiar faces that have dialed into this call. So it's great that you know, there's so much interest in these kind of briefings. As Jazz mentioned, I've just returned from Ottawa. It was the 4th round of negotiations for a global plastics treaty. And as we've just heard from Nicola, you know, there is really a strong need for these kinds of treaties because so many of the problems that we're facing, and in this case, the issue of plastic pollution, are so global in nature that they must have a global solution. And the mechanism through the United Nations to bring countries together to negotiate what can actually be done about the problem needs to happen through the treaty process. This is much more than a domestic waste management issue. There's lots of evil forces in the oil and gas sector that would like to convince you that the problem sits with you as a consumer to recycle your plastic waste. But the reality is that most of the products that we deal with on a daily basis are never designed to be recycled, even if we put them in our recycling bin. And even if they are designed to be recycled, quite often the infrastructure is not in place in many areas around the world. And so with the best possible intentions as a consumer, more than 90% of the plastic ever produced has gone to landfill or has leaked into the environment, with only single-digit percentages ever recycled. At the same time, what we see is this massive increase in the production of plastic globally. It's cheap to produce because oil is cheap. It's designed to be single use rather than reuse. It quite often has many different layers of polymer blends that make it impossible to recycle, even if you wanted to. And so this is not, the point I'm trying to get to is this is not a waste issue. This is actually a product design issue. It's an issue related to the amount of plastic that is produced globally, because so much of what we produce actually is not necessary, or it could be designed much better and differently for reuse, recircularity, and then ultimately at the end of its life, we know that it's been designed from the get-go to be recycled and to be recycled safely. One of the really important points that's coming through this whole treaty process as well is not just the fact that plastic is an environmental issue, but increasingly we're realizing the extent to which it's a human health issue as well. There are more than 16,000 chemicals used in the production of plastic. If you look at that plastic photograph on the screen there, you can see some are hard plastics, some are soft plastics, some are films that sit over food. They've all got fire retardants in them. Some of them have got colorings in them. They've got different kinds of plasticizers. They're all different kinds of polymer blends. And these are all, the recipe for all of these are closely held secrets by the polymer producers that quite often, even the brands, you know, if you think about Danone and Mars Corporation and Coca-Cola, all of these brands, quite often they don't even know the chemicals that are in the plastic containers that they are using to package up food or other materials. We Minderoo have been doing 5 years of work now to understand the importance of chemical impact on human health and the fact that micro and nanoparticles of plastic that get into our bloodstream because they're everywhere, right? We all have micro and nanoparticles of plastic in our blood. Those particles themselves may just pass through us, or they may not. They may lodge in different places at different times. but the chemicals that are in those particles of plastic we know are leaching into our bodies. And so there is a very real threat. There's an awful lot of science now being done to really understand this threat more deeply. And I can tell you from some of the discussions I had, particularly with the brands, they are starting to sit up and pay attention to the human health consequences in a way that they haven't necessarily sat up and paid attention to the environmental consequences previously. Our thesis has always been that humans care about the environment, but they care about themselves more. And they care about their kids and they care about their grandkids. And if you are concerned that there's toxic chemicals that are affecting your long-term health, like fertility rates and increasing rates of autism and ADHD globally, there are mounting medical studies that show these long-term health consequences are related to the relationship we have with chemicals, and by default that comes back to the relationship we have with plastics. So why did I tell you all of that? The Global Plastics Treaty recognizes that there is no silver bullet to the plastic pollution issue. We need to focus all the way through the supply chain. When something gets to its end of its life, it needs to be designed to be disposed of and recycled safely. But we need investment in alternative materials. We need to turn the tap off on unnecessary plastics. We need to ensure that plastics are safe and that the chemicals that are being used in plastic are actually tested to ensure that they aren't having a long-term impact on human health. Of the 16,000 chemicals I mentioned before, a tiny number of them have ever been assessed for their impact on human health. And so there are growing calls in the international community to start dealing with some of these issues. Just to cap on the points on the left-hand side of this document, again, as Nicola said, the High Seas Treaty took over 20 years to get to this point where we are now ready for countries to ratify it. In recognition of the urgency of the plastics waste issue, the United Nations has set a much, much tighter, some would say impossible timeline for delivering a global plastics treaty. So it's really only been 2 years since the idea for a global plastics treaty was agreed to through the UN processes. And INC 5, which is the 5th round of international negotiations, is scheduled for Korea at the end of this year. And at that point, the final text of the treaty is meant to be agreed. Maybe if we go to the next slide, please. Between now and INC 5, there's a lot of work to be done. There was approval through the processes in Ottawa to engage with intersessional work, which is great because it means countries can get together and continue to do the work, particularly on the chemical harms that I spoke to. So there's a working group focused on that. There's also a working group that is focused on understanding whether the imposition of a fee right at the top of the supply chain can be a way to help fund the control measures that a treaty would agree to. So getting a global plastics treaty with strong control measures is the first step, but then it has to be implemented, and that's going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Where is that money going to come from? We believe it should come from the polluters, following the polluter pays principle. And if the polluters were required to put just $100 a metric ton onto the production costs, then you would, over time, collect the money that you need in order to clean up legacy waste, invest in alternatives, ensure that you can actually fund all of the developments that need to happen over the coming period, the next 10 to 15 years, in order to clean up this giant mess. So I'll pause there. I think I'd just like to say before I close, There is a coalition of high ambition countries. I'm very pleased to say Australia is one of those high ambition countries. I think there's 65 countries now in that coalition that are calling for a legally binding treaty. Australia's shown great leadership at INC4 and will continue to do that. There is a great opportunity to be working with our Pacific neighbours on this. They, in many respects, are at the very end of the supply chain of the plastic waste issue. So much that they receive in trade is in plastic, but there's no reverse logistics to kind of help clear the problem back from those Pacific countries. So there's a huge amount of work to do. We're very committed and dedicated to it, and I'm happy to answer questions in the Q&A. Thanks, Jazz.
Fantastic, Tony. Thank you. And thank you to everyone for sending through your questions into the chat. We're going to start off with a number of questions, and I happen to have Nicola Clark sitting right next to me. Look at that. We're going to come out of the presentation, and but I might first start, Don, coming to you. I think that's been an amazing overview about two very contemporary issues there. And we know that on the call, we've got a lot of people from a real diverse range of sectors. But as you know, Australia is known for having an enormous amount of talent and expertise in the area of marine science. What is the role of science and the development of new knowledge and that interaction with the law of the sea? How does that work in reality? Receiving scientific knowledge and information and then it moving into something like LOSC?
Well, I guess traditionally that's been reflected in the way in which Australians and the Australian government have gained a knowledge and understanding of the Australian maritime domain. And the most obvious example there is the extent of the Australian continental shelf and the way in which Geoscience Australia and other Australian government agencies are absolutely critical in terms of assisting the Australian government to putting a submission consistent with the convention processes to determine the outer limits of Australia's continental shelf. But I guess your question is more going to the question of the management of the Australian maritime domain and the management of marine areas more generally. And I think what we've heard from these presentations by my colleagues is that the process of negotiating new international instruments to reflect some of those challenges is often a very time-consuming one, and that is principally because of the way in which international diplomacy traditionally works, and the fact that if you need to get state agreement by the members of the international community, there's 194 member states of the United Nations, for example, who in principle can be invited to participate in these agreements. It is inevitably going to be a very lengthy and time-consuming process. And I agree with Tony, the progress in terms of the plastics treaty is really remarkable. That's being partly driven by science, but the diplomatic effort that's being put into that and the success to date is really quite outstanding.
So thank you. And I think that notion of the law needing to lag behind science to an extent to see what the knowledge says and then to come up with the rules is right. Can I just press you though on the precautionary approach that maybe creeps in as a result of that, where I think you mentioned that sometimes that can become extreme, where we may wish to actually then do nothing because we've got these competing, we've got information, but we've got this time-consuming exercise that needs to go on. Maybe tell us about the precautionary approach.
Look, I think we've seen a number of examples where, because there is a lack of scientific knowledge or a lack of understanding about the consequences of certain types of activity, the response of some groups of states has been to say, well, no development can occur. And perhaps the most extreme example of that is the moratorium on all mining in Antarctica, which was adopted under the Madrid Protocol in 1991, that Australia was really pivotal in terms of moving forward on, because of this great uncertainty as to what could be the consequence of mining activity in Antarctica. And to a degree, we're seeing that now reflected in the debate and discussion within the International Seabed Authority, where, as I said before, while we're on the brink of that activity possibly going forward entirely consistently with the convention's framework, some states are still saying, well, actually, are we really clear? Are we really certain as to what the consequences could be of mining the deep seabed and the environmental consequences arising from that? So some states are now saying, well, no, we should perhaps think about a moratorium, perhaps not a permanent one, but certainly one to allow us more time to think through these issues.
Nicola, in terms of, thank you, Don. In terms of just following on from that thread and that call around deep seabed mining and the BBNJ, can you maybe just tell us how are those two things linking up?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it sort of links to, I think one of the challenges of the BBNJ agreement is how it will relate to these other management bodies like the International Seabed Authority that manages mining, as well as how it will relate to the bodies known as regional fisheries management organizations, which manage fishing, etc. And so while, of course, this new agreement cannot tell other bodies what to do, it can, at least in theory, be used to create some pressure for action. And so, you know, for example, one of the provisions within the agreement actually allows BBNJ parties to make recommendations to other bodies. Recommendations for specific management measures, as an example, so that you could see that as a pathway. But certainly, I think this general idea of precaution, as an example that Don was just speaking to, is I think a big part of why we've seen a surge for at least a precautionary pause on deep seabed mining, just because of the uncertainties that exist around the consequences and the impact that mining would have on the environment.
Thank you. Just in keeping in that linking up with different things that are going on, you and Tony have just talked about two very big pieces of work happening in parallel. You were actually in the room when BBNJ was signed and the cheering happened and what have you, so reflected glory around all of that. Can you tell us where the plastics treaty maybe came up in BBNJ? And then I'm going to come to you, Tony, and ask the opposite. Thanks.
Sure. Well, I mean, I'll say maybe just as an anecdote as civil society, I know when we first were starting with BBNJ negotiations, we were thinking, man, how do we tap into the energy and momentum that the plastics treaty has? Because we need to make the BBNJ treaty sexy like plastics is. But then it was really interesting to see how sort of, I guess, substantively some plastics related issues came up in the conversation of BBNJ, but I was surprised because it didn't come up in the way I expected it to. So it was actually conversations. There was a lot of conversations around actually the impact that some plastic cleanup projects have on biodiversity, right? Because as we have so much plastic pollution in the oceans, eventually that actually creates an ecosystem in its own right that has biodiversity living amongst it. And so in some instances, there were some efforts to clean up biodiversity, and actually questions about, is plastic cleanup, does that need to go through environmental impact assessments to make sure that it's not having sort of harmful effects on the marine environment? And might BBNJ EIA provisions be a way to counteract that? So so I think that was really, that was the spot where I saw it come up. And to book in my anecdote, when we got the treaty finally agreed, I was having a meeting with a minister who said, we need to figure out a way to get the BBNJ energy and momentum into the plastics treaty.
The irony. But no, they are maybe riffing off each other to that end. Tony, how maybe did BBNJ and that treaty come into the plastics treaty negotiations, if at all?
Yeah, not so much, to be honest. I mean, I think the key message here is that there's a whole lot of multilateral initiatives globally that are focused on the oceans, and it's a pivotal time actually, because the BBNJ, the deep sea mining, the Global Plastics Treaty. There's also work through the International Maritime Organization on decarbonizing shipping, and there's work through the World Trade Organization to get rid of harmful fisheries subsidies. And so there's all of this activity that seems somewhat disconnected, and to a certain extent it is, but it coalesces around this push to really you know, improve the way that we manage human activities in relation to oceans, and stop doing the extent of damage that we have been doing for so long, and to focus more on conservation and sustainable use, right? And they are, in my mind, two sides of the same coin. I think the key thing with plastic is, you know, it causes terrible harm in the ocean, and everyone hates washing it up on beaches. And, you know, if you've been surfing or you've been diving and you just find plastic in places that you would much prefer to find corals and fish. But the solution to that problem is not beach cleanups, right? As much as I admire the community groups that get on the beaches and clean up the plastic, and I've done my fair share of it, if we don't turn off the tap on plastic production in the first place, and if we don't get the design of plastic right, and if we don't get the whole supply chain around reuse and circularity right, and if we don't make all of the investments further up the supply chain, then we'll never stop it leaking into the environment. We're never going to stop it getting into the oceans. So the treaty really is about, as I was saying earlier, looking at all of the interventions that need to be made right through the plastic supply chain in order to turn off the tap on plastic and stop it becoming the environmental issue that it currently is.
That's huge. So massive re-engineering of the way we live. If I could come to you, Don, just on the High Seas Biodiversity Treaty and where it's up to. Australia has a joint standing committee on treaties. Can you maybe tell us about the process to bring forward a treaty for consideration by that committee? My assumption is that that's the committee that, you know, passes these things through. Can you talk us through the steps?
Look, formally, the process for Australia to become a party to a convention or a treaty is what we refer to as ratification, and ultimately that's an executive act of the government of the day. But there is a parliamentary process that has been up and running now since the late 1990s, in which, as you say, there's a joint standing committee on treaties, in which that committee has the opportunity to hear from the relevant government agencies who are sponsoring and promoting Australian ratification of a treaty, but then it's open to civil society to make submissions to why they think it's a good thing for Australia to become or to not become a party to a treaty. Interestingly, at the moment, notwithstanding some of the momentum we've been talking about, the Joint Standing Committee on Treaties does not have the High Seas Biodiversity Treaty before it by way of consideration. Now, that might be due to the parliamentary cycle, but if we're going to meet that sort of ambitious target of Australia being one of the first states to ratify within the course of the next year, those processes will need to start fairly shortly.
Thank you. Tony, just back to your design comment there around items and objects as a major driver. Can you give us examples of the types of innovative products or research that you think need to be pursued to deal with that? Is there something that, you know, you've seen and you know, we know you see a lot of things that you just think is hitting the mark?
There's great examples of alternative materials being produced that could replace hard plastics, that could replace a lot of soft plastics. A lot of that is in early development stage, and the challenge with so many of these things is how do you scale it to the kind of level that we need to, and how do you get through kind of the usual valley of death that all innovation faces when, you know, you're up against the oil and gas majors who see, you know, tripling their production of plastic over the next couple of decades as, you know, basically a massive contribution to their bottom line. And so, you know, the weight of, you know, the weight of those companies and their behavior is what, you know, all of the small innovative companies are up against. And so, yes, there are great examples of alternative materials. We've made some great progress in some areas of just getting rid of the stuff that's unnecessary. Different jurisdictions in Australia have managed to do that. Different jurisdictions around the world have managed to do that. It creates business opportunities for the people that are, you know, producing the the alternative knives and forks and straws and what have you, and coffee cup lids and all of that stuff. But that's kind of a drop in the ocean compared to what's required. There's quite good alternative, you know, hard plastic materials starting to come online. It's just a question of how you get enough momentum in to scale, and then ultimately to displace, you know, the original items from the market. And so there's a regulatory component to that. There's an investment component to it. And there's a consumer component, right? I'm a strong advocate that consumers should not wear the cost of this issue. It's not up to consumers to decide which product to use, but consumers do have power, right? Because they can vote and they have a voice. We all have a voice in this. But I'm a strong believer that actually governments should do the hard work and regulate and sign up to plastics treaties and what have you to get, you know, the really strong control measures in place that drive the change.
Appreciate that. Thank you. I think that echoes that quote that Lucy put up earlier around, you know, getting better at the policy triggers for the sorts of science or research that we need and the knowledge that's required to actually then bring that in. So really appreciate that. I'm going to go to a few rapid fire questions coming in from our audience here. Nicola, do you have any thoughts on marine-based carbon dioxide removal and the associated concerns to marine biodiversity? How can we achieve the best outcome?
Absolutely. Great question. I think it's a really, really timely topic that's emerging and will become an even more important topic for us to consider. You know, I think it sort of reminds me a bit of some of these questions around, you know, plastics cleanup and even seabed mining, where, you know, certainly there are some arguments that point to this is something that we really need to be considering, but also these are activities that can pose really, really great risk to biodiversity. And so there needs to be a great deal of caution and precaution that's exercised as they're considered. So I think, you know, actually ocean carbon dioxide removal could potentially be a test of the BBNJ environmental impact assessment requirements, right? Which have fairly, you know, requirements in terms of, you know, if an activity is going to cause substantial harm to the environment, it must, an environmental impact assessment must be conducted. The sort of documents, the assessment, the reports, that data and information has to be shared and has to be made publicly available so that there can be, you know, some holding to account of decision makers. And so I think that could be, and there's also a requirement, while it is ultimately up to government to decide whether or not the activity proceeds, there are at least obligations in the treaty that says, you know, if this activity is going to have, you know, irreversible harm, your decision should be to not allow the activity to proceed.
Fantastic, thank you. To Don, we can see most countries have signed but not ratified the High Seas Treaty. Not knowing much about the ratification process, can you cover in a bit more detail what's considered and what would typically stop adoption?
Look, I have to say that's a bit of a hypothetical at the moment, but I think what can you legitimately observe is that the issues associated with the high seas are more distant, more discrete, are not ones that would necessarily raise very intense sovereign national interests in the way that other aspects of the law of the sea, such as the United States position on the convention that I described beforehand. And given that, as we've heard, this has been such a long-standing negotiation process, many states will be very keenly aware of all of the issues. So I don't envisage there being many significant hurdles for states in terms of moving forward, providing that they meet their relevant domestic processes. And of course, every state has its own domestic process, which in some cases can be politically contentious.
Very helpful. Do you have a comment there?
I was just going to build on Don's points, which I completely agree with, and maybe just to add on that, you know, signing typically is a quicker process than ratification. And so I think it's to be expected to see a higher number of signatures come in quite quickly and ratifications come in a bit more slowly. In many countries, I should say in most countries, signing can be a fairly simple executive decision, whereas in many countries, the process for ratification is much more involved and requires, in the United States, for example, where I am from, it requires Senate approval, which is just a much longer process. So I think, you know, that sort of mismatch between number of signatures and number of ratifiers is almost to be expected at this stage, just because it only opened for signature, you know, what is it, 6 months ago or something like that. So countries are still very much in the process and going through their own domestic procedures that they have to in order to ratify.
If I can just add, I don't necessarily see that mismatch that Nicholas just outlined in any way as a cause for alarm, and that really things just working their way through the system and everything's on track at the moment.
Very helpful. I note that we're at time. We might continue for another 5 minutes if that's okay. Do feel free if you need to go. It's at 2 o'clock, but we do have lots of great questions. Well, actually, there's a question here for everyone. How are the Pacific Island countries and territories involved with the treaty discussions currently? How are they equipped to handle the management of such large ocean states, as the Pacific Ocean is the largest in the world? Great question. I might hand to you first, Nicola, and maybe just do a quick round robin. Thanks.
Happy to. So I'll say that within the BBNJ negotiations, the Pacific Island nations negotiated or worked together as a bloc, and really, really effectively as a bloc. In fact, there's a number, I think all of the key asks that the Pacific Island nations wanted to see ended up in the BBNJ treaty text. And in particular, you can trace some of their contributions to the final text, particularly with regard to the inclusion of traditional knowledge as one type of information that must be considered whenever it's available and applicable in making sort of these sorts of decisions, as well as there are a number of specific references to the inclusion of Indigenous people and local communities as a specific stakeholder group that must be included in consultations for all of these different BBNJ decisions. So I think they certainly were a really powerful bloc and a powerful voice for those issues, as well as I would argue, you know, pushing that sort of landing zone and middle ground for the BBNJ treaty text in a more sort of a stronger, more conservation oriented space.
Fantastic, thank you. Don, let's go to you.
I have nothing to add. Nothing to add.
Great, thank you, Tony. Anything on the Pacific nations and what you've been involved in?
I really just echo what Nicola's just said. You know, they're present. They really are a block and very effective in that. What I would probably add is that from a philanthropic perspective, one of the things that we are doing is with BBNJ, but also with the treaty, is to help developing countries engage with the process, because quite often even just travel support sometimes is necessary, you know, in order countries get delegations there. Sometimes there's capacity building in the legal system that needs just to be developed to engage with the process. So there's actually a significant number of philanthropic funders that have come together to support countries engage with the BBNJ process, and we're doing a similar thing with the plastics work as well.
Fantastic. That's a great place for us to finish the conversation. I'd like to thank virtual claps, no doubt, from around the world, everyone who's been involved, all of our presenters today, Lucy's earlier presentation, and our amazing experts here. We will be exploring all of these topics further in coming events and as part of the Knowledge series. I highly recommend Don's fantastic book. It's just a quick read on the plane, maybe, or maybe on a ship, but I do commend it to you. We've been delighted to bring this particular conversation, which is so current right now, and we will be ensuring that we come back to you with with further updates. We really love receiving comments and any further questions. Please do feel free to send those through to us at info@oceandecadeaustralia.org. And thank you very much for joining us. Thanks to all of our presenters. Cheers.